Dear students, welcome again. In the previous section, I talked about the ages of English literature, that why English literature is divided into different ages, and I also talked about why Anglo Saxon period is called Anglo Saxon period. So, in this section, I will be introducing you to some of the important literary figures of the time. So, the first important literary figure to whom I would like to introduce you is Caedmon. He was in fact the most important religious poet of the times, and he flourished around 658 to 680. And as I said, he was the first old English Christian poet whose fragmentary hymn to the creation remains a symbol of the adaptation of the aristocratic, heroic Anglo-Saxon verse tradition to the expression of Christian themes. Now, why Caedmon's poetry is important? Before Caedmon, we have another name, that is Bede. Bede also wrote down poetry and he was a great poet, but Bede chose to write down in Latin, the language of the previous rulers, because it was prestigious to write down in that powerful language. And interestingly, if you look, then you will realize that many writers choose to do so. Many writers choose to, write down in the powerful language or in the prestigious language. For example, Iqbal, Allama Muhammad Iqbal, when his early poetry, if we look at his early poetry is mostly in Persian language, the language which was very prestigious. So, Caedmon chose to write down in English, the old English. So, he was the first poet who chose to write down in English. So, that is very important thing. And I have seen that the Caedmon is still very popular with the British people and with people, literature loving people all over the world, and Caedmon's poetry is available online. So, the link is available. So, if you are interested in listening to Caedmon's poetry, you can listen by clicking the link which I will be providing you. I think it will be very interesting for you to learn about the life story of Caedmon. How Caedmon became a poet. How did he start writing poetry? So, his story is known to us from Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Caedmon was a stable worker at the Monster of Whitby in the 7th century. He was not a poet at that time. He was a very ordinary servant, and he used to work in the stable in a monastery. So, we must also remember that the Anglo Saxon people had a great love for singing. They loved singing, and it was common for men to gather of an evening and share tales through song. Everyone was expected to contribute. However, Caedmon was very shy, and he always slipped away, because he was very shy to sing, or simply had nothing to share. So one day it happened that Cadman slipped out of the hall to look after the animals, to tend the animals, while the other people, his fellows, sang. After some time, he fell asleep. And in the dream, a man spoke to him. So he had a vision. The man said to him, Cadman, sing me something. Cadman replied, I cannot sing. That is why I am here, out here, not in the hall. And the man said, yes, you could sing. And he suggested Cadman that he should sing the beginning of all things. In his dream, Cadman began to sing his great hymn of creation. Now let us praise the guardian of the heavenly kingdom, the power of the Creator, and the counsel of his mind, the works of the Father of glory. Now he, the eternal Lord, originated every marvel. When Cadman awoke, he remembered the verses exactly, and he was able to sing them. And the monks were convinced that he was a gifted poet. And Whitby's famous abbess Hilda, or in history they call her Hild, she convinced Cadman to become a monk. Here a thing is coming to my mind, that how and why the people of those times got convinced that Cadman was a born singer. Among the Arabs, whenever a poet was born, they celebrated the birth of a poet. It's very difficult to understand why and how did they come to know that this little child who cannot even speak will be a poet. But according to the Arab tradition, the person whose father was a poet, whose grandfather was a poet, then the child born to that father or grandfather will be a poet, because according to their beliefs, poets are born. So I think a similar tradition might prevail in the English people of that time, that they realized that poets were born, and Cadman was a born poet, and their intuition was right. Because although Cadman never learned to read or write, he listened as the monks told the Bible stories, and then he turned them to the Anglo Saxon poems, and the common folk could understand. So he was a born poet, Cadman was a born poet, and his poetry is religious in nature. And many other people imitated him in it. With the result, Bible teaching became very popular, it became very easy. So Cadman was the first poet who produced vivid Christian verses in the Anglo Saxon language or in the Old English. But this is very unfortunate that only a few of his verses or only a few of his lines survive. He died around 680. The people of England remember him as a saint. So if we look at Cadman's poetry, then we can say that all of his poetry was on sacred themes, and his unvarying aim was to turn men from sin to the right path. And in spite of all his poetic renderings, that Caedmon supposedly made. However, it is only the original dream hymn of 9 historically precious but poetically uninspired lines that can be attributed to him with confidence. The hymn, now available in 17 manuscripts, some in the poet's Northumbrian dialect, some in some other English dialects, set the pattern for almost the whole art of Anglo Saxon verse. So, Caedmon was a very important and influential poet. He not only produced poetry in the local or indigenous language, that is Old English, but he influenced and inspired a whole lot of other writers, a whole lot of other poets to write down poetry in the indigenous language, that is Old English. And there was a group of poets, they were called followers of Caedmon, and they wrote in Old English. So, another equally important poet of that time was Cynewulf. Cynewulf wrote down Christ, and it is the most important poem of Cynewulf. So, it was actually a metrical narrative of leading events of Christ's ministry upon earth and its return. So, it is about a great religious topic which is treated with grandeur. So, you can realize that Cynewulf was also a religious poet. He wrote about Christianity, and he used his poetry like Caedmon to guide people to the right way. So, after that, I would like to introduce you to Beowulf. Now, what is Beowulf? Beowulf is one of the most important remains of Anglo Saxon literature, that is the epic poem of Beowulf. Its age is unknown, but it comes from a very distant and hoar antiquity. It's like a piece of ancient armor, rusty and battered, and yet strong. So, these are the comments of Henry Wordsworth Longfellow, an American poet, about Beowulf. So, Beowulf was the most important poem of Anglo-Saxon period. Its writer is unknown. It was actually a tale of adventures of Beowulf, the hero who is a champion and slayers of monsters. Beowulf is a heroic poem, and it is the highest achievement of Old English literature. It deals with events of the early 6th century, and it is believed to have been composed between 700 and 750. Although it was originally untitled, it was named after the Scandinavian hero Beowulf, whose exploits and character provide its connecting theme. There is no evidence of a historical Beowulf, but some characters, sites and events in the poem can be historically verified. This poem did not appear in print until 1815. Beowulf is full of adventures and allusions to the great events and to the fortunes of the kings and nations, and thus form a historical account of the times. It provides us information about the society of those times. This poem, Beowulf, has been translated into modern English by Seamus Heaney and by other people. Many movies are based on Beowulf as well. For example, Beowulf 1999, Beowulf 2007, Beowulf and Grendel, Beowulf Prince of the Gates. You will find it interesting to know the story of the Beowulf. Beowulf falls into two parts, and it opens in Denmark, where King Hrothgar's splendid mead hall has been ravaged for 12 complete years by nightly visits from an evil monster. The name of the monster is Grendel. And Grendel carries off the king's warriors and devours them, eats them greedily. And then there comes a young man unexpectedly, a prince of the gates of southern Sweden. He arrives with a small band of warriors and offers to the king that he will cleanse the place of the monster, that he will kill the monster. Hrothgar is astonished because he does not know the warrior, but welcomes him, and after an evening feast and with some courtesy, some discourtesy, the king goes back to his place, leaving Beowulf in charge. And the night comes, the monster Grendel comes from the moors, tears open the heavy doors and devours one of the sleeping gates. And then the fight begins. Beowulf grapples him, whose powerful grip Grendel cannot escape. But he wrenches himself, tearing off his arms, and leaves. And the Grendel is mortally wounded. So the next day is of rejoicing in Heorot. But at night, as the warriors sleep, Grendel's mother, another monster, comes to avenge her son, and she kills one of Hrothgar's men. In the morning, when Beowulf wakes up, he seeks her out in the cave, at the bottom of a cave, and kills her. He cuts the head off from Grendel's corpse and returns to the palace. The Danish people rejoice one more. Hrothgar makes a farewell speech about the character of the true hero, as Beowulf, enriched with honors and princely gift, returns home to his own place. So that was the first part. In the second part, passes rapidly over King Haglic's subsequent death in a battle of historical record, the death of his son, and Beowulf succeeds to the kingship and his peaceful rule of 50 years. But now a fire-breathing dragon ravages his land, but aging Beowulf engages it. He is an old man now because 50 years have elapsed. The fight is long and terrible, and a painful contrast to the battles of his youth. Painful too is the fact that many of his followers have left him. Only his young relative, which is known in history, which is known in the story as Wiglaf, remains with him. Beowulf kills the dragon but is mortally wounded. The poem ends with his funeral rites and a lament. So this is the complete story of Beowulf in two parts. Now, it is significant that his three battles are not against men, which would entail the retaliation of the blood food, but against evil monsters, enemies of the whole community and of civilization itself. And many critics have seen the poem as a Christian allegory, with Beowulf as a champion of the goodness and light against the forces of evil and darkness. And his death is not seen as tragic, but as the fitting end of a good, some would say, too good hero's life. So here you could see the picture of Beowulf preparing to cut off the head of the monster. Thank you very much.